Hello, I have a short presentation today on who will be the founding fathers of modern scientific astrology. So let me see if I can share my screen here and we'll get started. And I just have to get rid of a couple of windows so I can see what I'm doing. So just bear with me for a second. And let's see. Okay, and here we are. Who will be the founding fathers of modern scientific astrology? I'll begin with a couple of quotes. First, from Arthur C. Clarke. I don't believe in astrology. I'm a Sagittarius and we're skeptical. And now here's a quote from me. Say what you will about astrology. It's still more reliable than statistics. Okay, I'm actually going to start just talking a little bit about the founding fathers of America, which is a very interesting topic in and of itself. So let me read this here. The American Revolution took place over the years from 1765 to 1783, and America's founding fathers are viewed with reverence by most Americans, as they tend to see their country's origin as being just as much a spiritual event as it was a physical historical event. Also, when viewed from an astrological perspective, the founding of America happened during a time of some very critical astrological events. So let's take a look at the extraordinary times America's founding fathers lived in. Okay, I've got a list of planetary alignments on the left here, and this is not the complete list, just some of the more important stuff I could fit on this screen. So the list of planetary alignments on the left is enough to show that the American Revolution took place during an extraordinary time. However, of all the outer planetary alignments that occurred between 1760 and 1790, what I want to focus on are the two oppositions between Saturn and Chiron that occurred in the summer of 1776, the conjunction of Jupiter and Chiron, and a subsequent grand trine of Jupiter Chiron with Neptune and Pluto that happened during the summer of 1787. But first, let me say a word about how I understand Chiron. Okay, so the aspects I'm going to talk about in particular are those which are highlighted in blue over here. Okay, now on to Chiron. Well, Chiron is a small heavenly body that orbits between Saturn and Uranus, and based on the stories in Greek mythology of the centaur Chiron, many astrologers interpret Chiron only with respect to wounding. However, if we understand the planets as representing psychological drives within us, then it makes little sense for us to have a drive to wound ourselves. Other astrologers, however, note that Chiron appears to be a bridge between the visible world, Sun through Saturn, and the invisible world, Uranus through Pluto. And my personal experience of Chiron and my experience through historical research is that Chiron is a drive within us that urges us to go beyond the world we can see. In that respect, Chiron nudges us toward a reality that is larger than the one we begin our lives with. Okay, now if I had to give one word to describe Chiron in its purest form, that word would be joy. It's the kind of joy and light you may experience when you hear the music of Tchaikovsky or read the poetry of Walt Whitman, both of whom had Chiron prominent in their charts. However, not everyone is ready for such an expanded state of consciousness, and that is where the wounding comes in. Some people first need their hard Saturnian shells to be cracked before the light can enter, and that is why I sometimes call Chiron the LSD of planets. It wants to enlighten us, but it may wound us in the process. Hence, as I often say, you can't make a cosmic omelet without first cracking a few cosmic eggs. And over here, I make the point that when we are experiencing the best that Chiron has to offer, that LSD becomes light and spiritual development. As a case in point, I want to take a quick look at Pope Francis. Pope Francis began his adult life as a chemist, but when he was 21, a Saturn transit activated his Sun Chiron opposition, and he developed a very severe case of pneumonia. As a result, he lost most of one lung, and afterwards he became a Jesuit and then a priest. He is a classic example of a wounded healer that became a shaman. Now, let's take a quick look at this opposition. Think of the sun as representing the self, and Chiron is this higher, more transcendent, and actually very joyous energy that is in opposition to the self here. Now, oppositions always start out like this with two poles, and we tend to identify usually with one of these poles originally, but the goal is for these two opposites to integrate with one another and act together. Also, Sun and Chiron, as you can see here, they're very close to the moon's nodes, the lunar nodal axis, and that just intensifies everything. So when transiting Saturn got close to the sun in this chart, that is when Pope Francis had this healing crisis. He was very sick for a long time with pneumonia, lost most of the lung. But after that crisis, he changed directions in life. He became a Jesuit and then later a priest. And I'm not going to say that I agree with all of Pope Francis's positions on every single issue. I don't agree with all of Catholicism, for instance, but that doesn't matter. When I look at Pope Francis, I see a person whose heart is filled with love for others. And that represents this Chiron, this higher, more transcendent energy of Chiron being fully integrated with the sun, which represents the self and the inner soul. And when you can do that, you go from being wounded or wounding others to becoming a light unto the nations. So, Pope Francis is a good example of someone who has integrated this Chiron drive with his very being and is an example exemplifying the best or this higher purpose and energy of Chiron. So that's what Chiron is all about, in my opinion. Now, let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence for America. The passage of Americans' Declaration of Independence took place on July 2nd, 1776, and occurred between two exact oppositions of Saturn in Libra and Chiron in Aries, and shortly after Saturn was stationary direct. The spiritual nature of Chiron is reflected in the document in the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Okay, now, there is an opposition between Chiron and Saturn and whatever July 1776 chart you might use for America. I prefer the July 2nd chart, which reflects the passage of the Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress. Many other people use the July 4th chart, which is when the Declaration of Independence was printed and began to be distributed. And in both those charts, the opposition between Saturn and Chiron, it's there, but it's not all that strong. However, that doesn't matter. There's something more important going on here. Uh, Around the beginning of the summer, you did have an exact opposition. And you had another exact opposition around the end of the summer in 1776. And right after this first opposition, Saturn was moving retrograde. So that means people were thinking about this thing, mulling it over, uh, contemplating the structure this might take and if they should make it a concrete reality. And then shortly before that Declaration of Independence was passed, Saturn turned direct. And you had both Saturn and Chiron moving direct. However, it wasn't too long before Chiron began to turn retrograde, and that can be a period in which people want to contemplate or think about these things a little bit more. So there's actually this period from June 17th to about July 23rd in 1776 when both planets were moving direct. And that was the optimum time for declaring independence. Okay. Now let's also take a look at the US Constitution. The United States Constitution was written in the summer of 1787, and astrologically, it was influenced by both a Jupiter-Chiron conjunction in Gemini over here on June 16th, and a grand trine involving Jupiter, Chiron in Gemini, Neptune in Libra, and Pluto in Aquarius over here on July 15th. The year is 1787 for both of these. And these aspects seeded the young country and the world at that time with lofty and transcendent ideas. In the opening words of the United States Constitution, we the people reflect not only the higher spirituality of Chiron, but also the presence of Pluto and Aquarius that always shifts power from individuals to the people. And this brings us to the extraordinary times we live in now. Okay, so let's take a look at that. I'm going to get a quick sip of water here. Today, we find ourselves once again living in extraordinary times. The Barbo Planetary Cycle Index, a cumulative sum of the distances between outer planets, began to reach its low for the century at the beginning of 2020, just as Saturn and Pluto were conjunct each other and a powerful lunar eclipse, and it reached its absolute bottom in March 24, 2022, a month after the start of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Meanwhile, the December 2020 conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn signaled a shift from this conjunction occurring in Earth signs to a new cycle occurring in air signs for the next 300 years. And on top of this, Pluto has moved into Aquarius. The United States has experienced a Pluto return and is still struggling to retain its democracy. There was a momentous solar eclipse in spring of 2024 with the Sun, Moon, and Chiron all exactly conjunct at 19 degrees 24 minutes of Aries. And soon after, America began the first of 3 Chiron returns. The astrological times, they are a-changing. And right now in this Barbo Planetary Cycle Index, we're about here. We're coming out of that bottom and starting to ascend again. So things are feeling much better overall than they were in March of 2022. And that is despite various conflicts still going on around the world. Okay. Now, furthermore, in February of 2026, a triple conjunction of the Moon, Saturn, and Neptune at 0 degrees Aries could signal big changes for both Russia and the United States. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions historically align with upheavals in Russia, and the American Civil War began as Neptune was last moving into Aries. Okay. On the other hand, the most beneficial day of the century might occur in July of 2026, when most of the outer planets find extraordinary harmony with one another at 4 degrees of positive signs. This configuration is reminiscent of the conjunctions of Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto that ushered in major world religions and philosophies around 576 BCE, before the Common Era. And around this time, This is when we saw things like the beginning of the golden age of Greek philosophy, the Torah being written, uh, parts of the Upanishads being written, uh, the development of Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism. So many religions and philosophies beginning at that point in 576 BCE or thereabouts. And this is going to be an extraordinary time for the century, July 21st, 2026. We've got Pluto, 4 degrees Aquarius, Neptune, 4 degrees Aries, Uranus, 4 degrees Gemini, Jupiter, 4 degrees Leo. And then we have Sun, 0 degrees Scorpio, trine North Node, 0 degrees Pisces, sextile Chiron, 0 degrees Taurus, trine South Node, 0 degrees Virgo, sextile the Moon. So that's going to be a good time, hopefully. Furthermore, there will be a whole lot of good aspects occurring in the second half of the 2020s. And this will help us get beyond the trauma the world experienced in the first half of this decade. And Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto will form a mini grand trine. So you can see I've put blue rectangles around a lot of the better things going on. And in 26 and 2027, we'll have Uranus sextile Neptune. Neptune is going to sextile Pluto, and then Pluto is going to be making a trine with Uranus, and that creates a small triangle that some people like to call a mini grand trine. It's one trine and two sextiles joining these planets together. And that's going to bring in a lot of this higher, more transcendent energy or vibration into people's consciousness. Okay, so as you can see, this is an extraordinary time, and an extraordinary time for astrology too, as it is using modern tools such as statistics, extreme case sampling, and well-crafted case studies such as those done by Andre Barbeau and Rick Tarnas to shift astrology from mere fortune telling to becoming a modern scientific discipline. Additionally, evidence of connections between celestial and terrestrial events is coming too from scientific disciplines outside of astrology, disciplines with names like chronobiology and heliobiology, and also from non-astrological researchers who are nonetheless finding statistical results that confirm traditional astrology. And if you are currently engaged in evidence-based astrological research, then you might be one of the founding fathers of this new emerging form of scientific astrology. So this is one of the big points I want to make. The founding fathers of America, they were living during times that were extraordinary, both from an astrological point of view and from a historical point of view. Similarly, today, we are also living through extraordinary times from both an astrological point of view and a historical point of view. There have been radical changes since the beginning of this decade, since 2020. And as far as astrology goes, the question is, which version of astrology will we choose for the future? Will we continue to use astrology uh, primarily for fortune telling, as many people view it? Actually, many astrologers today, I would move them a little further to the right along this continuum, because probably the majority of astrologers function as counselors and psychotherapists. But others are moving us toward astrology as a well-defined science. Uh, that is what is emerging now. But the question is, are we going to continue to go in this direction, or are we going to move back to this direction? Or are we just going to stay somewhat in the middle and just be content to be individual counselors for people? By the way, a 2023 update to a famous study done at MIT in the early 70s called Limits to Growth still predicts that civilization will likely fall apart around 2040. That's a bummer. I have a kind of a brown circle here marking off where 2040 is going to be approximately. And if you look at these various curves here, uh, let's see, the solid curves represent the recalibration in 2023 of this limits to growth study. And you can see things which are on the downswing or the upswing. Going down are non-renewable resources, pollution's going up, population is going down, food production's going down, industrial output is going down. And if we look at what's going on astrologically about that time, uh, the limits to growth study predicting a collapse of civilization in some respects. Astrologically, that looks about right. Boy, and you can see from 2039 to 2044, we have an unusual number of tense astrological aspects occurring between outer planets, not the least of which is Saturn square Chiron, which will happen 10 times. 10 times in this period, it will be exact. And even though for individuals, there are individuals here and there who will experience the transcendent side of Chiron, when you look at the masses, you're probably more likely to get wounded. So this will probably leave a mark as well, many of these other tense aspects. Okay, I want to look at some statistics and some important astrological studies. In the early days of statistical analysis of astrology, many may have believed that more athletes would be born with Sun in Aries and more mathematicians would be born with Sun in Gemini. We now know, however, that things are not that simple. Furthermore, it should be assumed that most astrological effects, defined here as any link between celestial and terrestrial events, are both weak and subtle because otherwise we would not be able to modify them through free will. On the slides that follow, I'll show you 10 essential studies, but be aware that these studies are only the tip of a very large iceberg. So, even though I've picked out 10 very important studies, there are many other studies that are just as essential. Also, some of the lessons that have been learned over the years are: one, most astrological studies need large amounts of data in order to have enough statistical power to detect astrological effects. Two, single astrological factors, even when statistically significant, usually result in only small effect sizes. And three, to achieve effect sizes that are moderate or larger, multiple astrological factors often need to be combined to form a more sophisticated astrological signature. Okay, now I'm not going to read all the titles of all these papers or all the authors because we need to get through all 10. So I will read through the synopsis I have down below. So study number 1. This study improved upon Gauquelin's original methodology and removed a possible source of subjective bias by defining eminence in terms of the number of journal citations, and showed that as eminence increases, the strength of the Mars effects for athletes also increases. So the Mars effect, prominent athletes, they tend to have Mars either rising or culminating around the midheaven at the time they're born. And this shows that the Mars effect works best with a quantitative rather than a qualitative assessment of eminence. Okay, study number 2. I really love this one. This was essentially looking at something like the Mars effect, but applying it to dogs. So, meticulous records are kept of pedigree dogs for the first 2 months of their lives. These records typically include birth time, birth order, and behavioral characteristics. This study of 500 pedigree dogs done by two French scientists characterized their behavioral traits using a method developed by iSync and found that pedigree dogs with an angular sun or Jupiter are far more likely to exhibit the extroversion dominant trait. So this shows that angular planets affect other mammals too. In other words, astrology, it can apply not just to people, but to dogs and probably other forms of mammals. Okay, number 3. This refers back first to a famous or infamous experiment that was done to see if astrologers could match birth charts with uh, results of personality tests. So, the famous or infamous Carlson experiment reported to show that astrologers were unable to match horoscopes with personality traits as measured by the California Personality Inventory. Opponents of astrology saw this as further proof that astrology doesn't work, while others were severely critical of Carlson's methodology. And still others, such as Ertel and Curry, found statistical significance upon reanalysis of Carlson's data. In this study by Godbout, this one, an automated matching test, comparing astrological charts with biographies, keywords for natal charts were paired with keywords from individual biographies in an automated way, and charts were matched with a significance level of p less than 0.0005. That's highly significant. And this shows that artificial intelligence can do chart matching. So this was great because this took a lot of subjectivity out of trying to match uh, the horoscopes with the personality descriptions, the biographical descriptions. Okay, 4. This is a study on astrology and introversion and extroversion. Psychological literature classifies some professions as better suited for extroverts and others as better suited for introverts. Using the Gauquelin data, Dr. Kiosti Tarvainen gave each chart an extroversion score based upon the number of planets, ascendant, and midheaven in positive signs, either air or fire. And he showed that individuals with higher extroversion scores are more likely to be drawn to extroverted professions with a probability or p-value less than 0.02. So this shows that there are measurable differences between positive and negative signs, with the positive signs being more drawn to what we think of as these extroverted professions. Okay, now Dr. Kiosti Tarvainen has done numerous remarkable studies on what works and what doesn't work in traditional astrology. In this study that used data collected by the Gauquelins, 300 astrological statements found in the Astrologer's Handbook were tested, and Dr. Tarvainen found that 180 statements in the handbook were correct, while 136 were not correct. The overall p-value was p equal to 0.001, and this shows that many, but not all, traditional astrological rules are valid. Okay, number 6. We're going to look at 2 studies on mundane astrology. That is the astrology of world events. And this study, first one by the late Dr. Holt, changed a qualitative analysis of the relationship between conjunctions or oppositions of outer planets and mundane events to a quantitative analysis by comparing the number of news highlights in a given year to the frequency of outer planet conjunctions or oppositions in that year or the previous year. And in 2023, Robert Curry showed that the strength of the association varies with orb. And taken together, this shows that mundane astrology does indeed have some validity. Okay, number 7, uh, by Ertel, the late Professor Ertel. This study by Professor Ertel showed that the Gauquelin-Mars effect, is unrelated to astronomical variables such as distance of Mars from Earth, angular size, apparent magnitude, declination, right ascension, solar elongation, radius vector, geomagnetic activity, or Mars-Sun conjunctions. Whereas some effects of the Sun and the Moon on life on Earth have been linked by chronobiologists to changes in either light, gravity, or ocean tides, these findings by Ertel suggest that some astrological effects may have causes that are outside of our current understanding of physics. In other words, either new physics or new understandings of old physics may be needed to fully explain astrology. Okay, get a quick sip of water here. These last 3 studies go together, and they show that some of the ancient astrological beliefs about the phases of the moon, uh, they're valid. So, in the ancient Babylonian calendar, the days of the new moon, first quarter moon, full moon, and third quarter moon were regarded as both holy days and evil days. Holy if you refrain from certain actions, and evil otherwise. The study mentioned above, this one, found a significant increase in aneurysm ruptures around the time of the new moon. And the next 2 studies found conditions that are more prominent at either the full moon or the quarter moons. Taken together, these studies confirm traditional astrological beliefs that tensions are greater around certain phases of the moon. And in particular, this one shows that the new moon is linked with certain tensions. Okay, this next study, it found increases in mortality associated with the first and third quarter moons. So the quarter moons are also linked with certain tensions. And I really love this last study because it's very, very thorough. Traditional astrology posits that one's mental state is more disturbed during a full moon, and this study provides confirmation through examining the quality of sleep during a full moon. The researchers found that in adults sleeping under controlled laboratory conditions during a full moon, that delta brain waves decreased by 30%, the time needed to fall asleep increased by 5 minutes, the length of sleep time decreased by 20 minutes, endogenous melatonin levels decreased, and the participants reported diminished quality of sleep. I should point out that the study was done indoors. The participants did not know that there was a full moon outside, and they were not told the purpose of the study. But taken together, these last 3 studies show that new, quarter, and full moons are linked with certain tensions, just as astrology has long maintained. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the future of astrology. So, what is the future of astrology? Well, that depends on us and others. One thing is certain, however, unless we continue to develop an evidence based version of astrology, it will continue to be viewed simply as an unsubstantiated form of fortune telling that many people see as an entertaining novelty, while others will see it as a dangerous solution. It's only when there's a preponderance of undeniable scientific evidence that others will begin to take the science of astrology seriously. Also, what some scientists view as only anecdotal evidence of astrology, I view as case studies. And when done with care, case studies in astrology are no different from the case studies that were done for decades in cultural anthropology in order to better understand new cultures, or that are done today in the field of mathematics education in order to understand how people learn mathematics. Case studies are still an important source of information for astrology, but the methodology has now been refined by astrologers such as David Cochran, who has utilized the technique of extreme case sampling in order to better understand the impact of various astrological factors while removing a possible source of sample bias. However, when feasible, extreme case sampling should be followed up by good statistical analysis. There are many instances where extreme case sampling is about all you can do. This is, for example, taking the most extreme cases of Gemini and examining the biographies of those people to get a sense for what it really means to be Gemini. Extreme case sampling is used, for instance, quite routinely in DNA research to help us understand uh, the consequences of having certain things within our DNA. Okay, currently I see 5 sources of information about astrology that should be pursued, and each individual source can provide details that the others may miss. The 5 sources of information that I identify are case studies, extreme case sampling, statistical analysis, mathematical modeling and theorem proving, and artificial intelligence. Case studies can provide meticulous details regarding how an astrological condition is manifesting. Extreme case sampling removes some bias in sampling and clarifies astrological effects by considering only the most extreme cases. Statistical analysis lets us know how likely what we've observed is just due to chance and how strong the effect is. And it is often seen as the gold standard for whether or not an astrological effect is real. Mathematical models and theorem proving can help to provide us both a technical understanding and, upon interpretation, a conceptual understanding of what is really going on in astrology, as well as guide us toward new astrological truths. And artificial intelligence can be used to identify and verify patterns in data that have been overlooked. Also, as is done by many businesses and institutions of higher education, modern evidence based astrology needs a vision statement of what we want the future to look like, a mission statement of what our particular role in achieving that vision will be, short and long term goals that can help us fulfill our mission, a regular evaluation of our progress toward achieving those goals, and actions to be taken uh, if we are falling short of our goals. Additionally, the following avenues should probably be pursued: the development of even larger and more complete databases, the inclusion in statistical studies of estimates of effect size and statistical power, along with the calculation of statistical significance and a periodic meta-analysis of statistical results. Research collaborations with other disciplines like chronobiology, heliobiology, mathematics, statistics, computer science, psychology, and astrophysics, and greater emphasis on research and the incorporation of a research methods course into all schools of astrology. Good statistical analysis can help us differentiate between what really works in astrology and what is just a boobamice, to use a little Yiddish, an old wives' tale. Additionally, while statistics can validate that some version of astrology works, a complete understanding of how astrology works may also require new understandings of physics and the relationship between all life forms and our cosmic environment. And now we are at the end of this presentation. And now that we are at the end of this presentation, let me summarize our journey. First, America's founding fathers lived during an astrologically extraordinary time, and they did extraordinary things. Today, we again live in an astrologically extraordinary time. This is a time of growth for both technology in general and scientific evidence-based astrology in particular. There's already an abundance of scientific evidence for astrology, that comes from both astrologers and non astrologers. Hence, we may be the founding fathers of the next astrological revolution. And with regard to that, I'll end with just one final quote by William Gibson. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen. And I'm back. So that's it for this short presentation on who will be the founding fathers of modern scientific astrology. Whether you are involved with scientific astrology or not, whether you're a statistician or not, I hope you got something good out of this. And I hope you get a sense that there actually is some scientific astrological validation for astrology out there. And with that, I'll say so long and be well.